Welcome to a tale of the American Old West, where danger lurks behind every dust cloud and love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Today, we'll follow the story of a mysterious stranger whose chanced encounter with a young heiress chained to railroad tracks changes both their lives forever. This is a story of rescue, redemption, and a romance, born between dust and danger. Before we begin, if you already enjoyed this type of video, leave your like to support me. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the desert landscape as Thomas Kane guided his weathered horse along the dusty trail. The year was 1887, and the railroad had brought both prosperity and chaos to the frontier towns scattered across the territory. Thomas had learned to avoid the main routes, preferring the solitude of forgotten paths where a man's past could remain buried beneath layers of sand and silence. Thomas was a man of few words and fewer friends. His dark eyes held secrets that even the brightest campfire couldn't illuminate, and the Colt revolver at his hip had seen more action than most men twice his age. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, heading toward the mining town of Copper Ridge, when the distant sound of steel on steel caught his attention. The rhythmic clacking grew louder as he crested a small hill, and there below him stretched the gleaming rails of the Southern Pacific Line. But something was wrong. The sound wasn't the familiar rumble of an approaching locomotive. It was something else entirely. Thomas urged his horse down the slope, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. As he drew closer, the source of the noise became horrifyingly clear. A young woman, no more than 25, was chained to the railroad tracks. Her elegant blue dress, now torn and dusty, marked her as someone of means, certainly not the type one would expect to find in such a predicament in the middle of nowhere. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins, creating a fiery halo around her face as she struggled against the heavy iron shackles that bound her wrists and ankles to the rails. "Help me," she called out, her voice hoarse from shouting into the empty desert. "Please, someone help me." Thomas dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the sun-baked earth with purpose. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of whoever had left her in this deadly trap. The woman looked up at him with emerald eyes filled with both hope and terror. "Thank God," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die here." "Who did this to you?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside the tracks to examine the chains. They were new, expensive, not the kind of restraints a common bandit would carry. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "Men in masks came to my hotel room in Phoenix last night. They drugged me, and when I woke up, I was here." She paused, looking into his weathered face. "I'm Elizabeth Hartwell. My father owns the Hartwell Mining Company." Thomas nodded grimly. He'd heard of the Hartwells, one of the wealthiest families in the territory, with mines scattered throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Someone clearly wanted to send a message, and they'd chosen the most brutal method possible. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. The sound of a distant train whistle cut through the desert air like a knife. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The 3:15 freight train to Tucson was right on schedule, and they had maybe 10 minutes before it would come thundering down these very tracks. "The train," Elizabeth whispered, her face going pale. "Oh God, the train is coming." Thomas pulled a set of lockpicks from his saddlebag, tools he'd learned to use during his less honorable days. "Stay calm," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "I'm going to get you out of here." His hands worked quickly on the first lock, sweat beading on his forehead as the train whistle sounded again. Closer this time. The desert heat seemed to intensify with each passing second, and Elizabeth's breathing became more rapid as panic began to set in. "What if you can't do it in time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked up from the lock, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I will," he said simply. "I give you my word." There was something in his tone, a quiet confidence born of experience, that seemed to calm her. As he worked on the shackles, Elizabeth found herself studying this mysterious stranger who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. His hands were steady and sure, his movements efficient and purposeful. This was a man who had faced danger before and lived to tell about it. The first shackle clicked open, freeing her right wrist. Thomas immediately moved to her left hand, the sound of the approaching train growing louder with each heartbeat. The ground beneath them began to vibrate almost imperceptibly, a sign that the massive locomotive was getting closer. "Almost there," Thomas muttered, working on the ankle restraints. The chains around her feet were older, rustier, and more stubborn than those that had bound her wrists. He could see the train in the distance now, a black speck growing larger against the horizon. With a satisfying click, The final shackle gave way. Thomas grabbed Elizabeth's hand and pulled her to her feet, but her legs, weakened by hours of being bound in the sun, buckled beneath her. Without hesitation, he swept her up into his arms and carried her away from the tracks just as the freight train thundered past, its whistle screaming and its wheels throwing sparks as the engineer spotted the abandoned chains on the rails. They collapsed together in the shade of a large boulder, both breathing heavily. Elizabeth looked up at the man who had saved her life, really seeing him for the first time. Despite the harsh lines etched by sun and wind, there was something gentle in his dark eyes, a humanity that seemed at odds with the dangerous aura that surrounded him. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." Thomas helped her to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for such calloused hands. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said. Whoever did this might still be watching. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was the beginning of something much larger than either of them could imagine. The mysterious stranger had not only saved her life, but had awakened something within her that she'd never felt before, a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. The journey to Copper Ridge took them through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Arizona territory. Thomas had fashioned a makeshift saddle from his bedroll so Elizabeth could ride behind him on his sturdy buckskin horse. Ranger, the animal, bred for endurance rather than speed, carried them steadily through the afternoon heat. As they made their way toward the distant mountains where the mining town nestled like a jewel against the red rock cliffs, Elizabeth had never been this close to a man before, not in this way. With her arms wrapped around his waist for stability as they navigated the rocky terrain, she could feel the strength in his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breathing. And despite the traumatic events of the morning, she found herself feeling safer than she had in months. "Tell me about yourself," she said as they paused to rest, the horse near a small spring. "You know who I am, but you're still a mystery." Thomas dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary on her waist. "Not much to tell," he replied, leading Ranger to the water. "I'm just a man trying to make his way in the world." "That's not an answer," Elizabeth said with a small smile. "A man doesn't develop skills like yours. Those lockpicks, the way you handle yourself without a story." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Sometimes it's better to leave the past buried," he finally said. "What matters is what a man does from this day forward." Elizabeth studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hand never strayed far from his gun. "Someone hurt you," she said softly. "Just like someone tried to hurt me." He turned to look at her then, surprised by her perception. "The world's full of people looking to take advantage of others," he said. "The trick is learning who you can trust." "And do you trust me?" she asked. The question hung in the desert air between them like heat shimmer. Thomas found himself looking into her green eyes, seeing not the pampered heiress he'd expected, but a woman with depth and courage. She hadn't complained once during their difficult journey, hadn't demanded to be taken to the nearest town, or insisted on sending telegrams to her family. Instead, she'd quietly accepted his decision to take her to Copper Ridge, trusting his judgment completely. "I'm beginning to," he admitted. As they resumed their journey, Elizabeth found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The desert, which had always seemed harsh and forbidding from the comfort of a railroad car, revealed its hidden beauty when seen up close. Wildflowers bloomed in unexpected places, their bright colors defiant against the muted browns and grays of the rocks. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. "It's beautiful," she said, surprised by her own words. "Most people don't see it that way," Thomas replied. "They see only the danger, the hardship." "Maybe they're not looking hard enough," Elizabeth said. "My father always said that the most valuable things are often hidden beneath the surface." "Leave a comment about what you think of this story so far." They talked as they rode, and with each mile, the barriers between them seemed to lower. Elizabeth learned that Thomas had been born in Texas, that he'd lost his family in an Apache raid when he was 16, and that he'd spent the years since then wandering the frontier, taking whatever work he could find. He was educated. She could tell by the way he spoke, the books she glimpsed in his saddlebags, but he wore his learning lightly, like a man who had discovered that knowledge without wisdom was worthless. For his part, Thomas discovered that Elizabeth was nothing like the spoiled rich girl he'd initially assumed her to be. She'd been educated back east, but had returned to Arizona to help her father with the family business. She knew geology and mineralogy, could read a mining survey as easily as a novel. and had spent months learning Spanish so she could communicate better with the Mexican workers in their mines. "Why aren't you married?" Thomas asked as they made camp for the night in a sheltered canyon. The question surprised him. He hadn't meant to voice it. Elizabeth looked up from the small fire she was tending. "My father's been trying to arrange a marriage for years," she said. "He thinks I need someone to manage me." She smiled wryly. "The problem is, most of the men he approves of see me as a business arrangement, not a person." "And the ones he doesn't approve of?" Thomas asked, settling down across the fire from her. "They usually just want access to his money," she replied. "It's remarkable how romantic a man can become when he learns your father owns half the copper in Arizona." Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the dancing flames. "That must be lonely," he said finally. "It was," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft. "Until today." Their eyes met across the fire, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both learned to be wary of the world's intentions. Thomas felt something stirring in his chest, an emotion he'd thought buried along with his family back in Texas. Elizabeth represented everything he'd told himself. He could never have respectability, a future, a reason to stop running from his past. As the night deepened around them, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The desert stars appeared one by one, until the sky was ablaze with their light. Neither wanted to acknowledge that they would reach Copper Ridge by tomorrow afternoon, and once they did, this strange interlude would be over. She would return to her world of mining offices and society parties, and he would disappear back into the anonymity of the frontier. But as Elizabeth watched Thomas's profile in the firelight, she made a silent vow. Whatever happened when they reached civilization, she wasn't going to let this man simply walk out of her life. He had saved more than just her life on those railroad tracks. He had awakened her heart to possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Yes, thank you for everything." He looked at her across the dying fire, and in his dark eyes, she saw the reflection of her own feelings. Tomorrow would bring complications, but tonight, under the vast canopy of desert stars, they were simply two souls who had found each other against all odds. "Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." But neither of them slept much that night, both aware that their time together was running out like sand through an hourglass. Copper Ridge sprawled across the mountainside, like a hastily thrown handful of dice, its buildings a mixture of adobe, weathered wood, and canvas. The town had grown rapidly around the silver strike of 1885, and its streets buzzed with the constant activity of miners, merchants, and the occasional outlaw looking to disappear into the chaos of a boomtown. Thomas and Elizabeth rode into town just as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The main street was thick with dust, kicked up by wagons, hauling ore down from the mines, and the air rang with the sounds of hammers, pickaxes, and the occasional blast of dynamite from the mountainside. "We'll get you a room at the hotel," Thomas said, as they dismounted in front of the Copper Ridge Inn, a two-story building that looked like it had been built in a hurry but was sturdy enough to last. "Then I'll send a telegram to your father." Elizabeth nodded, but as they climbed the steps to the hotel's front porch, she caught his arm. "What about you?" she asked. "Where will you go?" Thomas hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't thought beyond getting her to safety. For the past day and a half, his entire world had narrowed to protecting this remarkable woman, and the prospect of leaving her behind felt like tearing away a part of himself he'd just discovered. "I'll find something," he said. "I always do." Before Elizabeth could respond, the hotel door swung open, and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the kind of pale complexion that spoke of too much time spent indoors. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed immediately on Elizabeth. "Miss Hartwell," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank God you're safe. Your father has been worried sick." Elizabeth stiffened, and Thomas immediately sensed danger. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, though he kept the motion subtle. "Mr. Blackwood," Elizabeth said carefully, "I wasn't expecting to see you here. Your father sent me as soon as word reached Phoenix about your disappearance." Blackwood replied smoothly. "We've been searching everywhere for you." His gaze shifted to Thomas, taking in the travel-stained clothes, the worn gun belt, the general appearance of a man who lived by his wits and his weapons. "And who might this be?" "This is Thomas Kane," Elizabeth said, stepping slightly closer to Thomas. "He saved my life. If this content is being helpful, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support me." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Thomas caught a flicker of something, recognition. In the man's eyes, "How fortunate," Blackwood said. "Your father will want to reward Mr. Kane appropriately for his service." There was something in the way he said service that made Thomas's blood run cold. He'd met men like Blackwood before, smooth, wealthy, and utterly ruthless beneath their civilized veneer. Everything about the man's manner suggested he was more than just a concerned family friend. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," Blackwood continued. "I'm sure Miss Hartwell would like to clean up and rest before we make arrangements for her return to Phoenix." "Actually," Elizabeth said quickly, "I think I'll stay in Copper Ridge for a few days to recover from my ordeal." Blackwood's smile became strained. "I'm afraid your father was quite specific about wanting you home immediately. He's been beside himself with worry." Thomas watched the exchange with growing unease. Something about Blackwood's insistence on taking Elizabeth away immediately didn't sit right. In his experience, kidnappers didn't usually leave their victims chained to railroad tracks without a specific purpose. And the timing of Blackwood's appearance in this remote mining town seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "Miss Hartwell has been through a traumatic experience," Thomas said quietly. "Maybe it would be better to let her decide what she wants to do." Blackwood's cold eyes fixed on him. "I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion. Mr. Kane, you've done your good deed. Now perhaps it would be best if you moved along." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas had heard that tone before, usually from men who were used to having their way through intimidation or worse. He was about to respond when Elizabeth spoke up. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. I'll send a telegram to my father myself, letting him know I'm safe." "Of course," Blackwood said, his smile returning but not warming. "But surely you understand his anxiety. After all, with the wedding only 2 weeks away." "What wedding?" Elizabeth interrupted, her face going pale. Blackwood looked genuinely surprised for the first time since the conversation began. "Your wedding, my dear. To my son, Marcus. Your father and I finalized the arrangements 3 days ago. Didn't he tell you?" Thomas watched Elizabeth's face crumble as the pieces fell into place. The kidnapping, the chains on the railroad tracks, Blackwood's convenient appearance in Copper Ridge, it was all connected. Someone had orchestrated Elizabeth's disappearance to force her into a marriage she clearly didn't want. "My father wouldn't," Elizabeth began, but her voice trailed off as she realized the truth. Her father, desperate to secure his business interests and seeing her as an asset to be managed rather than a daughter to be cherished, had arranged her life without consulting her. "The contracts are already signed," Blackwood continued smoothly. "A merger of our two families' mining interests. It will be quite profitable for everyone involved." "Except for Elizabeth," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. Blackwood turned his cold gaze back to Thomas. "As I said, Mr. Kane, this doesn't concern you. I suggest you take your payment and disappear before you find yourself in over your head." "The only thing I'm seeing," Thomas replied, stepping closer to Elizabeth, "is a woman who's been betrayed by the people who should be protecting her." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other guests and locals had begun to notice the confrontation, and Thomas could see several of Blackwood's men positioning themselves around the hotel's entrance. This wasn't going to end with words. Elizabeth looked back and forth between the two men, her mind racing. Everything she'd thought she knew about her life had just been shattered. Her father, whom she'd trusted despite his controlling nature, had sold her off like a piece of property. The kidnapping hadn't been the work of random criminals. It had been orchestrated to ensure she couldn't refuse the marriage. But standing beside her was a man who had risked his life to save her, who had asked for nothing in return, and who was now facing down dangerous men to protect her again. In Thomas Kane, she had found something she'd never expected to find. A man who saw her as a person worth protecting, rather than an asset to be acquired. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "You can tell my father that I won't be returning to Phoenix, and there won't be any wedding." Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Miss Hartwell. You're coming with me, one way or another." That's when Thomas drew his gun. The street in front of the Copper Ridge Inn fell silent as Thomas's Colt cleared leather with the fluid motion of a man who had drawn that particular weapon more times than he cared to count. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. And suddenly, every conversation, every footstep, every sound of daily life in the busy mining town came to an abrupt halt. Blackwood's hand moved toward his own weapon, but he froze as he found himself staring down the barrel of Thomas's gun. The other men Blackwood had brought with him, Thomas counted at least 4, began to spread out, hands hovering near their holsters. But none seemed eager to be the first to draw against a man who had clearly demonstrated his speed. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Miss Hartwell has made her position clear. I suggest you respect it. You have no idea what you're interfering with." Blackwood snarled, his civilized mask completely abandoned now. "The Hartwell-Blackwood merger has been in the works for months. Contracts have been signed. Money has changed hands. Elizabeth's personal feelings are irrelevant." "They're relevant to me," Thomas replied, never taking his eyes off Blackwood. "And they should be relevant to any decent man." Elizabeth stepped closer to Thomas, her heart pounding, but her resolve strengthening with each passing second. "Mr. Blackwood, you can tell my father that his business arrangements don't include selling his daughter. I'm 25 years old, and I'll make my own choices about my life." "Your father controls your inheritance," Blackwood said coldly. "Without his approval, you have nothing. No money, no property, no future. Is that really what you want?" "If that's the price of my freedom," Elizabeth replied, "then yes." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for the woman standing beside him. In the space of 2 days, she had faced death, discovered betrayal, and now was prepared to give up everything she'd ever known for the sake of her principles. She was stronger than he'd ever imagined, and braver than most men he'd known. "Besides," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger, "I won't be alone." She reached out and took Thomas's free hand, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture that was both intimate and defiant. The simple touch sent electricity through Thomas's entire body. And for a moment, he almost forgot about the dangerous men surrounding them. "You're making a mistake," Blackwood warned. "Both of you. Kane, you don't know who you're dealing with. I have resources, connections. I can make your life very difficult." "My life's already been difficult," Thomas replied. "A little more won't. Kill me." That's when Blackwood made his move. His hand flashed toward his gun, but Thomas was faster. The shot echoed through the mountain air like thunder, and Blackwood's weapon went spinning out of his hand, his wrist shattered by Thomas's bullet. The businessman fell to his knees, clutching his wounded arm and screaming in pain and rage. The other gunmen hesitated, clearly not having expected their employer to be taken down so quickly. In that moment of uncertainty, Thomas moved, pushing Elizabeth behind the cover of a wooden post, while keeping his gun trained on the remaining threats. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" he called out. One of Blackwood's men, apparently deciding that his loyalty didn't extend to facing down a gunfighter of Thomas's obvious skill, slowly raised his hands and backed away. The others, seeing their leader writhing on the ground and their companions retreat, made the wise decision to follow suit. Within minutes, Blackwood and his men had disappeared down the main street, the businessman being helped onto a horse while still cursing Thomas and Elizabeth with every breath. The townspeople, who had been watching the confrontation with the fascination that frontier folks reserved for good entertainment, began to disperse, though Thomas could hear the excited conversations as word of the gunfight spread through Copper Ridge. Elizabeth emerged from behind the post, her eyes bright with excitement and something else, something that made Thomas's heart race even faster than the gunfight had. She looked at him as if he were a hero from one of the dime novels she'd read as a girl. But more than that, she looked at him as if he were the answer to every prayer she'd never dared to voice. "That was incredible," she said breathlessly. "The way you handled them, I've never seen anything like it." Thomas holstered his gun, his hand shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "It's not something I'm proud of," he said quietly. "Violence should always be the last resort. But you did it to protect me," Elizabeth said, stepping closer. "You risked your life for someone you barely know." "I know you," Thomas replied, looking into her green eyes. "Maybe I've only known you for 2 days, but I know you better than I've ever known anyone. You're brave, you're kind, you're stronger than you realize, and you deserve better than being treated like property." If you liked this video, leave a comment below. I love hearing your opinion and answering questions. Elizabeth felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of joy, of relief, of finally finding someone who saw her for who she really was. "What happens now?" she asked. "Blackwood was right about one thing. Without my father's approval, I don't have any money, any resources." Thomas smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it was a smile completely free of shadows. "Then we'll make our own way," he said. "I know mining. You know the business side. There are claims to be staked. Opportunities for people willing to work hard. Together, Elizabeth asked, hardly daring to hope. If you'll have me, Thomas replied. I know I'm not much of a catcher-drifter, with a dark past, and not much to offer except my word and my gun. But Elizabeth, in 2 days, you've changed everything for me. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. For a future. Elizabeth didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped forward and kissed him. There on the dusty street in front of the Copper Ridge Inn, with half the town watching and the other half talking about the gunfights they'd just witnessed. It was her first real kiss. The first one that meant anything, and it was perfect in its imperfection. Dusty, desperate, and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure about this? He asked. Once you take this step, there's no going back. Your father will disown you. Society will shun you. Life with me won't be easy. Easy is overrated, Elizabeth replied with a smile that outshone the Arizona sun. I'd rather have a difficult life with meaning than an easy life without it. Besides, she added, her eyes twinkling with mischief, I have a feeling life with you will never be boring. Thomas laughed, a sound so rare that several passers-by turned to look. No, he agreed, it definitely won't be boring. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas and Elizabeth walked hand in hand down the main street of Copper Ridge. They had no money, no family support, and an uncertain future ahead of them. But they had each other, and they had something more valuable than gold or silver. They had love forged in the crucible of danger and strengthened by mutual respect and understanding. 3 months later, the Kane Mining Company filed its first claim in the mountains above Copper Ridge. 6 months after that, Thomas Kane married Elizabeth Hartwell in a simple ceremony attended by the entire town. And a year later, when word reached them that Jeremiah Hartwell had suffered a heart attack and was asking to see his daughter, Elizabeth was gracious enough to visit him, accompanied by her husband and their newborn son. Some stories end with the rescue. This one began with it. But what happens when love is tested by the harsh realities of frontier life? When the past refuses to stay buried? When a woman must choose between the security of her old world and the uncertainty of a new one? Those, perhaps, are stories for another day. What did you think was the best part? Leave your comment below, and let's talk about it. I love hearing from you and discussing these stories of the Old West, where love could bloom in the most unexpected places and heroes weren't always what they seemed. If you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next